The 2015 Disney movie Inside Out was promoted with the tagline, "Meet the voices in your head."
First day of school, very, very exciting. I was up late last night figuring out a new plan. Here it is, fear. I need a list of all the possible negative outcomes on the first day at a new school.
Way ahead of you there. Does anyone know how to spell meteor?
Disgust. Make sure Riley stands out today, but also blends in.
When I'm through, Riley will look so good, the other kids will look at their own outfits and barf.
Joy. Yes, Joy. You'll be in charge of the console, keeping Riley happy all day long. And may I add, I love your dress. It's adorable. Oh, this old thing? Thank you so much. I love the way it twirls. Train of thought, right on schedule.
It's one of the smartest movies ever made for more accurately illustrating how the human brain functions. It's important for mainstream media sources to depict things with a level of accuracy. People start believing this stuff and then spreading it as fact. For example, Google 70,000 thoughts per day. You'll easily find sources clearly claiming the human brain has that many thoughts in the average day. That myth is right up there with humans only using 10% of their brain. They made a whole movie about that. Or that 93% of all communication is nonverbal. All nonsense, with no scientific support. A new study with scientific support is showing we, as humans, think an average 6,200 thoughts per waking day. That makes more sense, and we're closer to understanding what influences the transition every 10 seconds from one thought to the next, inside and out. My name is Doug Downs. Music off the top, the theme from Inside Out, composed by Michael Giacchino. My guest this week is Dr. Jordan Poppenk from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Hello, Jordan.
Hi.
And you're actually joining us from Chicago today on parental leave.
That's right. Yeah, we've had a new son, and life is all over the place right now. So for now, it's taken us to Illinois and then back to Queens after that.
That's outstanding. Jordan, you are the Canada Research Chair in Cognitive Neuroscience at Queen's. You earned your PhD at the University of Toronto. You also have a Master of Arts from the U of T, University of Toronto, and a Bachelor of Science with Honours from Western University in my old hometown, London, Ontario. Your work involves brain imaging, lots of functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, to track neural evidence of memory reactivation within people's brains. You also study neural processes that underlie how people remember, which is kind of it's a holy grail thing in communications and marketing, to tell you the truth. Okay, thought worms. And the idea of how many thoughts the average person has in the average day. Just over 6,000 thoughts per day, per waking day, for the average person. Question one, of course, what is a thought worm? What percentage are conscious as opposed to subconscious? And any idea how many of them we might classify as positive as opposed to negative, since we seem to interpret everything as in an emotional state as humans?
Yeah, so there's a lot behind that big question. Maybe I'll just start by addressing the point about thoughts per day, and you know why we would do any kind of brain research to try and answer that question. And the answer is that it's in psychology a kind of old technique to simply approach people and ask them these things. Like, are you having a thought right now? Tell me when you're having a new thought, or press this key when you have a new thought, and then just measure it and call it a day. Certainly be a lot simpler than gathering brain images. And of course, the problem with this technique, which we describe as introspection, which is looking into your own mind to try and report what's there in a sense empirically. The problem with that is that we are really poor at describing our own internal state. It's a lot of it off, like not accessible to us. And for another thing, it doesn't seem to produce consistent, reliable measurements certainly across laboratories, but even within the same person. And so, not going into the whole history of it, but much of early science and psychology really started once people got off this idea that, well, we should be just asking ourselves these simple questions. So that's just a prelude to explain why we would take this far more complex approach. The strategies that my group's been trying to develop to learn more about people's internal state and their thoughts and their memories are instead focused on trying to like reach into a person's brain and observe without them having to say anything to us. What's the dynamic in there? What's going on? So that's the black box that we've been trying to crack. And there's big databases out there with people's brains and brain scans and ongoing for hours thoughts of them while they're just lying on their backs and not doing anything in particular. And so that's the box we want to crack, and that's where we started this process of developing some tools. And the tool that we developed was one that we call thought worms. And to help understand what this means, just imagine that you're drawing your thoughts on a piece of paper, and there's a long line that you're using to do this. And if you're like most people, it's not like a totally straight line, but it's kind of going in big swerves and detours as you are thinking of different things. But it turns out that if you take the brain's perspective on this, that it's not just big swerves and swirls. It's you actually taking the pencil off the paper and jumping to another point as you continue the line. And so, without getting into the methodology, which I'm sure we'll talk about, the idea is that there's these discrete points where in time where we've separated our prior state to a new state. And that creates on your piece of paper these little segments that we call worms. This then gives us access to other ideas, like we can count up the number of worms and say, well, how many of these were there in a period of time? And then we can get to this age-old question that we started with of how many thoughts in a day or other unit of time. By using that inference. We're going by proxy from something biological as opposed to a person's own efforts to try and communicate something. So that's the basic framework about what a thought worm is.
I have so many thoughts after hearing that. Let me try to focus. Do thought worms overlap? You talked about them kind of bouncing like a pencil off the page to a completely other part of the page. Mm-hmm. Do they overlap? And where does multitasking fit into this? Because, of course, now we're hearing multitasking is a myth. And, of course, I respect that. But at the same time, I have to think, I'm multitasking all the freaking time. I'm always thinking a million things.
Yeah. So our research is somewhat agnostic on that particular question because what we're observing is the state of the brain. So to go into a little more detail on like how we generate this line of thoughts, what we do is we take all of say we scan your brain for an hour. And during that hour, there's a new picture of your brain that's coming out like every second. So we've got all these different pictures, and we feed it into some statistical algorithms that assess, well, how different and similar are these pictures to each other? And pictures that are quite similar, they have similar patterns, they get put close, and pictures that are dissimilar get placed far away. And so what falls out of this process is this diagram of the line, which just because of the nature of your mind drifting tends to be very similar at one moment in time to the next, but quite distant as time proceeds. And again, these jumps take place in the process. So the reason I explain this is to sort of connect it to the biology. This is just how your brain looks over time. That's all that we're assessing. And so if you're multitasking, that is going to have it's going to appear as it would while you are doing even a single task, where perhaps as you get partway through task 2, you jump to some new aspect of it. It's still going to produce what appears to us to be a new thoughtworm because you've jumped from place 1 to place 2. So I suppose any deviation in whichever task is going to lead to the biological appearance of a new thoughtworm. But it's certainly a very interesting question as to, whether does this mean, for instance, that while you're multitasking, you should expect a higher rate of these thoughtworm transitions. And is that why it's more cumbersome to try and load up more than one task at a time? There's a lot of interesting open questions like this now that we've developed this tool.
That deserve more study for sure. And this study shows at least a better understanding of how our thoughts transform from one to another. So help me, how do I understand as a marketing and comms professional, again, I think it's kind of holy grail, how do I go from drinking a cup of coffee to thinking about something else in particular? And how do I influence that person? We're now at the stage in digital advertising where I can genuinely get someone in a moment in time. I know they're listening to music. I know they're working out. I might know they're at a coffee shop. We're at that stage. So how do I harness what they're doing and get them to think about my thing? How do I manipulate and influence them, Jordan?
Well, it's funny. Whenever marketing comes up in cognitive neuroscience, I tend to tell my students, like the practitioners are miles ahead of this relative to where we are on the theory, because I think the practice has been very effective, and obviously there's a lot of minds working hard to try and understand that, likely more than there are in academia looking at the fundamentals. In our case, what we're able to do is capture this transition, and it's a metric. But it's not explanatory. We're in need of theory to try and explain when this flight takes place from the perch of one thought to the perch of another. But I think that probably at this point in time, the clearest answers to how to steer a mind into your particular topic is best answered by a marketing professional.
Sure.
Where there's a lot of experience in that.
And I think heuristics play a big role there. The brain is basically a lazy thing that never stops working. And if I can put something in front of somebody, I might be able to capture their attention like that. 6,200 thoughts per day. That's one thought every 10 seconds, depending on your sleep pattern. How might that influence how I present, how I blog, how I podcast? How many thought worms is a listener experiencing during our 25 minute podcast episode? How does that influence how I present?
Well, you know what? I think that the immediate take-home message from this line of work is to give credence to the point that any experienced presenter would give to their students, which is slow it down and be concise. If you're looking at a set of slides that are full of text and you're trying to convey something to people, then of course they're going to quickly become overwhelmed and detach from your slide. You're trying to get them to shoehorn too many ideas into one state. And if we know that there's not just a point of interest in our audience, but actually a biological limitation in the amount of maneuvering a person can do in their mind, then it really underscores the imperative of those two factors, conciseness and pace. So again, I think this would not come as a surprise to a marketing professional, but I do think that it converges in a nice way. It kind of helps us see the tie-in point between our biology and heuristics and practice that seem to be effective.
I've got another podcast that I want to tell you about that I think you might like. Every week, the global creative agency Gray brings you exactly what you need to know to sound smart when talking about social media on the podcast 5 Things This Week in Social. The team at Gray have produced over 125 weekly episodes and were named Adweek's Best Agency-Hosted Podcast for 2022. The hosts have partnered with some of the world's biggest brands and are experts in social media and emerging tech. They'll discuss everything from the next Instagram feature to how we shop in the metaverse. Listen to 5 Things This Week in Social wherever you get your podcasts. Search for it in your podcast app with the hashtag and the number 5. That's 5 Things This Week in Social. Can you, because I have you here, can you help me understand memory a little better? So I've always read the hippocampus is basically the governor of at least midterm memory. In other words, if the hippocampus decides to drop it, then the memory can be gone. It can be completely, that exists. That's the thing. You don't store everything. Does the hippocampus hold the classic 7 to 9 things? Does it hold only 3 or 4 things at a time, which I think is the more modern thinking? We're not marvels of conscious memory. And is memory stored in various parts of the brain? In other words, it's not just one part of my brain that holds a specific memory, but all over the place. How does, if you can, in a couple of minutes or less, if you can, explain to me how memory functions in the brain, because I think it's an important part of what we do as well.
Sure. I mean, this is the topic of third-year college courses, so I won't give you a great appreciation of it in a few minutes. But I think that the key thing is to distinguish forms of memory, and we have the contents of our consciousness, what we're able to apprehend at this moment, and this is what you were referencing with respect to how many things can fit in there, and that's been as you mentioned, the subject of some evolution, and there's discussion about whether it's really 7 or 3 or whatever the number may be. And then there's our sort of memory of the world, and this is like knowing how to drive your car to work, and who the prime minister is, and things like this that are acquired over a long time. And then there's memories of what happened. If it's a thing that you can like put yourself in your shoes at a different time and place, sort of mental time travel, then it's like us seeing the world through our own eyes at another point in time. And that's the kind of memory that the hippocampus is really like involved with. And what the hippocampus is doing is creating a record of the contents of our consciousness. So it's like you take that experience that you had, and it's like you were, capturing it with a video camera, which, is a limited metaphor, but it's helpful in distinguishing it from the idea of ideas about the world. So that's the job that we think of the hippocampus doing, and it's the thing that we notice is problematic in people who've had damage to their hippocampus.
And I mean, a big part of your research and your study is on neuroanatomy. Do we interpret memory differently? If you and I saw the same thing, heard the same thing, smelled the same thing, whatever, tasted the same thing, do we interpret that differently and therefore create sometimes entirely different memories?
I think that the nature of your memory and my memory is really comes down to a function of our different conscious experiences. Again, it's really all filtered through your own lens, which is colored by, of course, your own extensive personal history with the world and with the things that we're experiencing. If we're tasting the same physical thing, stepping beyond the fact that, okay, we have different olfactory receptors and the physical sensations are actually going to be different to you and me. Let's make it simpler and say we're looking at the same painting. That's going to visually appear very similar in our two brains. But if it's a painting of say a banana, whether you've had bananas in your life or not is going to really color your impressions and reaction to that stimulus. So that's kind of taking the story away from memory. But I think where it comes to neuroanatomy and what you're getting at is that there's also these dimensions beyond our experience of how does the architecture differ from one person to another, independent of our different experiences. One of the big research questions in my lab is when you take people with different hippocampi, and morphologically they can appear very different, does this reflect a different kind of mode of operation? Does person one, who has a small hippocampal head and a big hippocampal posterior, do their memories tend to focus more on the details of their experiences and the visual percepts, whereas a person who's got the different opposite kind of hippocampus with a big head, maybe they're more focused on the big ideas and they're synthesizing things, but maybe overlooking some of the persnickety details. So whether those are different types of people is an interesting question to us, and it's also taken us down the road of trying to understand other potential differences among people that could evolve out of their different neural architectures. So one of those questions, of course, concerns thought worms. Can we explain different rates of thoughts in different people as a function of something in their brains? Perhaps the hippocampus is a contributor to that. This is actually how we got into thought worms, because we thought, well, if you're a kind of person who has a powerful memory system, perhaps it's snagging all kinds of things in your environment and sending you back into your memories, and therefore that's holding you in place for a while and not letting your thoughts drift off. You're kind of stuck in a like black hole of a particular memory. That particular thesis is one we're still exploring, but the notion that we could differ in these ways, I think, is a really interesting one to examine, and in particular in the sense that it sort of commingles with our development as individuals, that our experiences might reflect some affordances of our brains. And to give you an example, like imagine that you're someone who has a really acute sense of smell. Maybe for you, it's more practical to remember things about the world and to distinguish people and things in terms of how they smell. And for somebody else who doesn't have much of a sense of smell, and so you end up going very different ways. It's not necessarily that you are that way because your brain looks like this, but you got that place because of your brain starting out a little differently. So it's a nuance that sort of inserts development into the end point of what we see in the scanner, but is one that I think is very interesting.
I love this episode. I really appreciate your time and next steps in your work. It's always about doing additional research. There's always next steps. Tell me about what you're focused on and the applications for funding, because inevitably you have to create applications that express points of this is how this kind of research can help society and can help the scientific community as well. Tell me about where you're at with that.
Sure. Well, one branch of the individual difference work that I described is trying to understand differences in eyewitnesses. Perhaps, one person who saw a crime or an event can be counted on to deliver a certain kind of information better from their memories than somebody who has a different sort of brain. So we're looking at differences between people and assessing the quality of different aspects of their memory as a function of those neural differences. And that's already funded work. That's through SSHRC. Another set of questions, of course, concerns these thought worms, which is a focus for us in the near future. And there too, the sorts of questions you highlighted about multitasking, for instance, are interesting ones. The nature of how thoughts turn over in your sleep is an interesting one to us. It gives us access to dynamics that really can take us in a lot of different directions. So trying to identify the sort of sources of low-hanging fruit, places we can peer into in the immediate term with our new tool, is something that we've been doing. And I say we've been doing and that we're focused on, and the reality of this comment is I've been on parental leave for some time now, and I'm not back until April. So there's a bit of a hiatus in there, but once my son is old enough to start toddling around, then it'll be back to some of these big research questions.
Real quick, would your son, who's just a toddler, like from newborn, he's less than a year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does he have 6,200 thoughts in a day? Like, how does that differ by age?
It's a great question, and there are data sets available of participants that span the lifespan. And so that too is one of the questions that we've applied this tool towards, is to try and see, does an 80-year-old have a different pace of thinking than a 50, 30, or 2-year-old? It's a question we're waiting to answer. We've got all the data lined up and we've got our analyses churning, but we don't have output at this point.
Well, we'll have you back on after that research for sure.
Cool.
Thanks for your time today. I really appreciate it, Jordan.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
If you'd like to send a message to my guest, Dr. Jordan Poppenk, best way to do that is through the website at Queen's University. He's on paternal leave right now. The address is in the show notes. We're working on a Halloween episode and hope that you might be able to help us out. Would you be willing to share in a very short voice message your scariest PR or marketing moment? Maybe it happened to you. Maybe it happened to someone else. It could be about that scary boss or that time you hit reply all and oh no. Something like that, a short message. We don't need your name. We don't need your contact information. Just go to speakpipe.com/stories and strategies. From there, all you do is click record. And actually, when you do, if you don't like it, you muff it up first take. You had some thought worms that got into your head. Just hit stop and you can re-record. You can delete what you've got and re-record. It's real simple. speakpipe.com/stories and strategies. Stories and Strategies is a co-production of JGR Communications and Stories and Strategies podcasts. Our only request is if you enjoyed this episode, would you place one thought worm about this podcast into the mind of someone you know? Share it. Tell somebody. Thanks for listening.